The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Autogestion, Correcting the History of Self-Management by Livia K. Stone. This is an abridged and more podcast-friendly version of an essay in the journal Left History from 2024, Volume 26, Issue 2. The anarchist conception of self-management, or autogestion in Spanish or French, is a central anarchist concept generally associated with anarchist unions, or workers managing a factory by themselves without bosses. However, it has also been adapted throughout the world to take on different and more ethical or philosophical meanings. Unfortunately, the concept is much more well-known in Spanish and French anarchist literature than in English, in part because of translation issues. Investigating the concept in the context of colectivos autogestivos, or autogestive collectives, in Mexico City, I was surprised to find that the intellectual history of autogestion, as it is commonly repeated even in the literature, along with the accompanying citations, is almost entirely apocryphal. This essay attempts to correct some of that early history and straighten what has become a quite convoluted genealogy of the concept. Most publications describing autogestion will say that it is the French translation of a Slavic word originating in Tito's Yugoslavia of the 1950s that established workers' councils to manage factories rather than the Communist Party. I argue, in contrast, that the term arose out of the environment of revolutionary Algeria in 1962. This is not an ideological argument about autogestion, but an empirical one. I went looking for the appropriate citations in the literature about Yugoslavia and didn't find anything, finding instead the Algerian connection about a decade later. I argue that the Yugoslavia story itself is a relic of the specific politics of the Algerian context. The origin of the word itself is important because within its grammar is the most significant shift in leftist social movements of the 20th century. The self or auto and self-management autogestion represented a shift from the worker or peasant as the ideal or even the only legitimate revolutionary subject of the 1950s in a term such as workers' councils to a variety of collective selves, black folks, indigenous peoples, students, women, gays and lesbians, who were the revolutionary subjects of the 1960s and beyond. This is an important piece for our current understandings of identity-based so-called new social movements that remain incredibly important today. Within the articulation of autogestion is also the possibility for new, transgressive, or transcendent subjectivities detached from the terms of one's oppression. Self-management or self-production as punks, for example. In what follows, I will begin with a brief examination of when and how autogestion appears in the historical and activist literature. I then demonstrate how it emerged in Algeria in 1962 and how it came to be attached to the idea of Tito's Yugoslavia. Autogestion is generally translated as self-management in English, and yet, as with so much translation, it does a poor job of conveying its meaning. The term is perhaps not as well known amongst English-speaking scholars and activists because of its boring translation. The English term self-management seems to recede into the background as something that is almost meaningless or technical. In contrast, autogestion has the glow of significance around it. In his revolutionary plan of action from wildcat strike to generalized autogestion, the situationist Raoul Vaneigem wrote that, quote, only the coordination of struggles for total autogestion can liquidate the market system. Henri Lefebvre wrote in 1966, quote, the concept of autogestion today is the opening toward the possible. It is both the way forward and the endpoint, the force that can bear the colossal weight weighing on society and which can overcome it. José Revueltas' collective wrote in 1968 that, quote, autogestion is the living and active form of militant and critical knowledge. Social, economic, political autogestion will be the structural form that the introduction of socialism takes in Mexico, end quote. The literature of the 1960s uses autogestion as if it were an established political, ethical, and practical principle known to all. It needs no introduction. It was massively popularized as a slogan of the 1968 movements in France. It is only later in the 1970s and the 1980s that volumes on the subject began to describe its origins. Most of the literature that provides an origin for autogestion state outright or imply that the term's origins are in Yugoslavia. However, if this were the case, we would expect the term to be used throughout the 1950s, but it is almost non-existent in print before the early 1960s. Cornelius Castoriadis is often cited as one of the term's early proponents in the 1950s. However, a closer examination shows that Castoriadis, although absolutely talking about workers' councils and a progenitor of autogestion, never uses the term autogestion in his famous writings from the journal Socialisme ou Barbarie that are often cited. Only subsequent translations and prefaces to his writing after autogestion was popularized in the 1960s use the term. Other scholars such as Henri Arvon, Daniel Guérin, Alain Guillerme, Sam Dolgoff, and Frank Mintz spread the concept of autogestion all around the world and throughout time and injected it as an analytical concept into contexts where the term was not used at the time. Autogestion was an articulation available to the authors of these books in the 1970s, but not the historical subjects of their books. I don't wish to be too harsh on these historians, translators, and activists. I don't think that these scholars deliberately misrepresented use of the term. I don't believe that they were very interested in the term itself as a particular articulation that created something new, and so perhaps didn't even notice that they were using a different vocabulary than their historical subjects. An examination of French anarchist journals demonstrates very clearly that although the term appears in print a few times beforehand, the unmodified, unhyphenated term autogestion began to be used everywhere with confidence after 1962, and then especially after 1965, but not before. What was happening around 1962 that the term suddenly found coherence, and why would it have accelerated after 1965? These dates are of particular importance to the Algerian Revolution, a French colony until 1962 that had been engaged in a bloody 8-year war for independence. Algeria was in the odd position in 1962 that nearly all of its managerial and administrative class very suddenly left the country when it became clear that France would no longer protect their privileged status. Initially, the revolutionary government of Algeria used the term co-gestion, co-management, to refer to management between Algerian workers and the colonial managers' owners who might still return. However, even by the end of the summer of 1962, it was clear that they weren't coming back, and so the language shifted to autogestion, self-management, instead. The term autogestion was useful in part because the term was conveniently vague about the collective subject, but with a strong anti-colonial sense of local or Algerian. There wouldn't have needed to be a shift from Castoriadis's workers' councils to Algeria's autogestion without the anti-colonial, racial, and religious politics of the Algerian Revolution. Cell for auto was Algerian, Muslim, North African, but not necessarily a worker in the Marxist sense, a different, more identitarian collective actor. It also skirted Marxist terminology, which was largely seen as a European import, and therefore not properly Algerian. These early days of Algeria were complicated because their independence movement had strong socialist Trotskyist currents, but the popular base of the Algerian movement was quite suspicious of Marxism and socialism as a European import. Autogestion was useful as a particularly Algerian form of socialism to be contrasted with more European forms. Just a year after independence in March 1963, the March Decree defined the parameters of autogestion, but in the somewhat dry detail characteristic of bylaws. A further document, the Charter of Algiers, was taken up in April 1964 and was a much more radical document. It identifies autogestion as an essential characteristic of a uniquely Algerian socialism. I have found hardly any mention of autogestion in France at all before the March Decree and the Charter of Algiers, decrees in which autogestion is confidently claimed as the very basis of the new country of Algeria. The Charter of Algiers is an outlier. The historians and activists interested in autogestion generally agree that the new state relied on self-management as an emergency measure while it was needed, and then co-opted it as soon as it could establish an Algerian managerial class. The autogestive language and hopes for the new country were clearly crafted by the more ideologically Marxist factions of the revolutionary movement, with hopes that the principle was different enough to separate itself from European ideologies and flexible enough not to alienate the more religious Algerian factions. But it was precisely this North African post-colonial political context that produced the term and enabled its popularization later. Who was this group of revolutionaries, mostly Trotskyists, who promoted Autogestion? Anthropologist Ian Clegg identifies three names: Mohammed Harbi, Latfala Saliman, and Michaelis Raptis, or Michel Pablo. In my own work, I also add Daniel Guérin to the list. Harbi is the only Algerian and seems the likely link among them. In his recent book on Algerian Autogestion, Harbi writes that he agreed to be a presidential advisor expressly for advising the new president, Ben Bella, on issues of Autogestion. During his time editing the journal Révolution Africaine, he dedicated the publication almost entirely to investigating and reporting on the state of Autogestion in Algeria. Latfala Salman was an Egyptian bookseller who operated a salon of intellectuals and journalists, where he introduced Harbi to many others, including Ben Bella. At the time of independence, Salman had been imprisoned in Egypt for being a communist. Ben Bella intervened on his behalf with the Egyptian president, who released Salman along with a host of other communists and radicals to Algeria. It was these men, Harbi writes, who originated what have been called the worker and peasant Autogestion decrees, and they were the ones who propagated Autogestion as a slogan or a watchword. Harbi's statement is in tension with much of the literature that saw the decrees as very influenced by European Marxist ideology and not at all grounded in local or popular Algerian sentiment. The academic consensus is that the term was recognizably a product of the European Marxist tradition. The ulamas, for example, seen as the traditional Algerian Islamic leaders, seem to be entirely unconcerned with self-management. Even Harbi adds that Michaelis Raptis was the primary editor of the Autogestion decrees. Of course, to say that Autogestion was influenced by European Marxism is not to say that it was the European Marxists, like Raptis, who articulated the principle. There were plenty of Arab, North African, and Algerians who, while Marxists, were also decidedly North African. These are the men that Harbi points toward. There was a population of Marxist Algerians like Harbi, like Massali Haj, who had spent significant time in mainland France, and there were also international figures like Raptis and Guérin, who spent time in and were heavily influenced by the Algerian context. Raptis was amongst a large contingent of foreigners who were sometimes referred to as pieds rouges, red feet, to connect their communism to the recently departed colonists, some of whom were referred to as pieds noirs, or black feet. These were foreigners who were excited and inspired by the example of revolutionary and independence movements throughout Africa and Latin America as the optimistic way forward through the Cold War. It is difficult to remember, after many decades of the term Third World being used as a synonym for impoverished or underdeveloped, that originally the term referred to a third, optimistic, and more virtuous path through the imperialistic powers defining the First and Second Worlds. It was optimistic, seeing the future of the world in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Algeria was seen as a shining example of the possibility of this third way, this third world that might even transcend the nationalist nation-state organization of the world. It is this sense of optimism and radicality inspired by Algeria that infused the 1960s and 1970s enthusiasm for Autogestion. Harbi, Guérin, and Raptis, and the later historians agree that the Algerian system of Autogestion was based on the Yugoslavian model. Harbi writes that Raptis was the lead editor of the Autogestion decrees because he had the most experience with self-management in socialist countries, especially Yugoslavia. Why the choice of reference to the Yugoslavian experience? Harbi writes, quote, "This refers to the Algerian experience itself. The Yugoslavs were very early to aid the Algerians, including chartering ships to deliver arms from Yugoslavia, and they had experience in Autogestion," end quote. As a militant for the FLN, the National Liberation Front, whose job it was before independence to garner international support for an independent Algeria, Harbi was very concerned over Yugoslavian support for Algerian independence and was trying to solidify this relationship as much as possible. Historian Jeffrey Byrne describes that the partnership between Yugoslavia and Algeria had a lot to offer both countries, and they both sought out one another as important allies. Each was trying to forge its own way forward as a socialist country out from under the Stalinist reach of the Soviet Union. In its early days after independence, Algeria was attempting to carve out a position for itself as a unique independent nation with its own unique relationships to the major world powers. The more socialist factions saw a kindred spirit in the small country of Yugoslavia that had also managed to create its own sense of socialism apart from the Soviet Union and in relatively peaceful opposition to U.S. capitalism. Although everyone in this early crew of Autogestion enthusiasts cited Yugoslavia as a model, there was also a keen sense that Algerian Autogestion needed to be quite different. Byrne writes that both the Yugoslavian officials and Ben Bella repeatedly stated, neither taking offense at the distinction, that the Algerian version needed to be quite different from the Yugoslav version because of the different context. While Ben Bella saw Tito as an example and stated that the Yugoslav experiment was important to study, he also said that they would do so, quote, so that we in turn can freely create our own model, end quote. Indeed, the idea that Autogestion originated in Yugoslavia, but that it was a failure there because of the Communist Party, is an idea woven into the very fabric of the term and plays a significant role in how people were thinking and writing about Autogestion from the very beginning. It is a contradiction at the core of the popular anarchist history of the concept. Autogestion is from Yugoslavia, but it wasn't really Autogestion in Yugoslavia because it was authoritarian. I have heard this repeated many, many times from Mexico City area self-identified anarchists, and it is a story that seems to have begun with the Ben Bella administration in Algeria. None of these men in the Ben Bella government seem to have realized that the specific coinage of the term Autogestion as a principle was new. In his recent book on Algerian Autogestion, Harvey never mentions or seems interested in the origin of the term. I believe this is a major source of the misattribution of the word as a translation of the Slavic term. Autogestion's own originators continually told the story that they were following the lead of Yugoslavia. Even as they said that it was Yugoslavian, however, none of these authors ever used the term that I can find in their writing prior to 1963 when it appeared in the March Decrees. After helping to draft the Charter of Algiers, Autogestion took on a central significance in the writing of each of the men I mentioned above. The year 1965 is significant because it was the date of the military coup in Algeria that ended its socialist government and its experiment in Autogestion. The coup exiled Guerin and Raptis back to Europe and left Harvey imprisoned until 1973 in Algeria. After returning to Europe, Guerin and Raptis began the French journal Autogestion just as Castoriadis's Socialisme ou Barbarie was ending. This was the platform for Henri Lefebvre's first writings about Autogestion, probably inspired by his situationist friends who wrote militant letters in support of Algerian Autogestion in the early days of the nation. In short, the term Autogestion emerged in the early days surrounding the independence of Algeria amongst a transnational network of activists, militants, and officials in the Ben Bella administration. Furthermore, it gained coherence for a host of practical reasons specifically to the Algerian context, not external European or purely ideological ones. The Ben Bella government was seeking its own model of socialism that would stake a claim for Algeria apart from the Soviet Union, as well as the capitalism of the U.S. and Western Europe. It needed a position that seemed less dogmatically or overtly Marxist in order to not alienate the substantial portion of the population that saw Marxism as a further European imposition. It needed to describe the situation of very local groups of people organizing productive activities in a variety of ways and connect these processes to the idea of a democratic, anti-colonial, future-oriented Algerian, North African, and Islamic political and economic foundation. In the end, Autogestion as a principle seemed to be more inspiring to a foreign audience, the same foreign audience that Ben Bella seemed to be more popular among than a broad base of everyday Algerians. However, I don't think that this is a reason to discount its emergence in the context of Algeria. It was needed to articulate a certain set of ideas, including anti-colonial, anti-racist, autonomous self-determination, that signaled the beginning, possibly even enabled the beginning, of the more identity-based new social movements of the rest of the 20th century. Furthermore, the Algerian origins go a long way toward understanding why in the literature Autogestion is nearly always credited to Yugoslavia, with no evidence to support this origin, and a frequent immediate caveat that Yugoslavian Autogestion isn't really Autogestion because it was authoritarian. The very inventors of the word, or at least its very early promoters, told everyone that it was from Yugoslavia and incorporated the story into its very formation. The fact that Yugoslavia, as opposed to, say, Hungary, is so often cited as Autogestion's origin appears itself part of the Algerian origins of the term.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.